One of the highest grossing franchises of all time has released a new movie. F9 recently released after many delays, like a lot of movies these days, but now we finally have it. It is time to make my Fast and Furious ranking, starting from the worst and moving to the best. Before I get into this ranking, please let me know what yours would be down below. I'm interested to see, and without further ado, let's get into it. Coming in at 10th and last place is the newly released F9. If you're interested to see a long full review of this movie, I did it in my last video and I'll leave a clickable card for that up in the corner here. But essentially, I really didn't like this movie. It is easily in last place. Takes the absurd things about this franchise and just goes way too far over the top where it's not as entertaining for how dumb it is. It becomes really tedious. Besides taking these characters to space like the memes had foretold, there really isn't much going for this movie from my point of view. It is by far the most self-aware of this franchise, but that kind of ruins it when they start to dive into what they know the fans like about this franchise and try to just overdo it. For a film franchise that at the center of it is all about family, it feels a bit too late, 9 movies into the franchise, 10 if you're counting the spin-off, to introduce Dom's real family blood. I did a lot of flashbacks of that, but I just thought it was way too late for that for me to carry an interest. And as for that brother, Jacob, John Cena, his motives weren't very clear at all. So an absolute mess of the movie, topped off that they've kind of once again changed genre more towards sci-fi, which, oh, it's ridiculous. Coming in at 9th place is Too Fast, Too Furious. This movie does essentially feel like a spin-off. It has Brian O'Connor in it, but it doesn't really have any of the other characters returning from the first movie. However, it does stay loyal to its street racing roots. As well, it does introduce us to some characters, Tej and Roman, who at this time felt like minor characters who wouldn't be of any importance for the franchise going forward, but as you know, if you've seen all the movies, they come back and are the main comic relief for them. Even though I'm not a big fan of Roman, the character, he is an important one to the franchise's success. One thing that is apparent when watching this, especially after seeing all the other movies, is how cheesy this film is, but it does embrace that in the best possible way. However, with just 2 characters in the lead, it does kind of lack its charm at times, so it feels quite awkward. And also just the fact that the characters, the plot, very underwhelming, very familiar. So it is a poorly made film, but the campiness in it is quite entertaining. Looking back to it, seeing where this franchise came from, it's a lot more of an enjoyable watch than F9. Coming in at 8th place is The Fast and the Furious Tokyo Drift. Now this is an interesting one. The change of environment allows for some freshness, even though this franchise doesn't really need it at this point. As well as the introduction of Han, a fan favorite, was probably the best thing to come out of this movie. But overall it is still a very cheesy film. The dialogue is extremely poor to the point where at times my ears felt like they were bleeding. And the same goes for the acting, including the lead character. I just didn't care for them at all, so it's hard to be too invested in this movie. However, it is a lot of fun. Looking back to it, I kind of feel bad for what they've done with this movie because they've tried to weave it into coming just before Furious 7. It really doesn't make sense. You see the technology, the clothing, the slang maybe, that they use in this film, which was made like 10 years before Furious 7, so it's hard to make it believable that this film was either in 2015, 16, or that Furious 7 was in 2005 or 6, whenever this was made. So it is a very fun movie, one which die-hard fans of this franchise either love or hate. I don't mind it. It's certainly not one of the best, but it was enjoyable to look back at this one. Coming in at 7th place is The Fate of the Furious. This was my first time watching this film since I saw it in cinema when it first came out. Rewatching it, I couldn't believe how much worse it was than I remembered. There were many problems. One thing which wasn't a problem was Jason Statham once again returning after Furious 7, but with a much more comedic role this time around, as well as being on our hero's side. It was hard to go through a scene watching him without a smile on my face. Putting him and Hobbs on the same team was a fantastic choice, as it allowed for so many hilarious moments. But as great as those two were, they cannot drown out the very big problems this film has. It's no secret that these films are very over the top, but just it fully embraces it here, which doesn't exactly make for the most enjoyable time. Yes, if you're just a normal movie watcher, you'll enjoy this, won't think twice about how dumb it is. Rewatching it, it's really apparent how overpowered Hobbs is. It just felt too silly at points. In the previous film, it was funny when he flexed his bicep and his cast broke off. That was funny, but then they've made it like he seemed bulletproof in this film. Not just that, but more silly things like the hacking of the cars to drive by themselves. It just didn't work for me this second time around now that I'm older. And I don't want to sound like a killjoy, but I found it rather cringe-inducing at points, as it does lose a bit of that charm along with it. One final thing, it's an interesting dynamic to have Dom be a villain for this movie, even though he's blackmailed, even though he has to convince them that he is on the bad side, he has to fool them. It looked like he was enjoying being a villain. There were so many things he didn't need to do, and there was other ways he could give a hint, but just having him on that side, you lose that chemistry with the main crew, and in doing so, a lot of the characters become quite irrelevant and forgettable. Coming in at 6th place is Fast and Furious. First of all, forgive me, it's just started to rain, if you can hear that. But this is where the franchise really started to shift away from that street racing. Yes, it does have a lot of those elements still in it, but you can see as you watch through these movies, this is where it starts to gradually lean towards other things. This is actually one of the most forgettable movies in this franchise, as it deals with a familiar plot just with a few little details changed, especially within this franchise, as it is that transitional phase into more heist-like movies. Even if it is forgettable, it is a very important one. If you take it out, things would be different. But overall, it's a fun enough adventure, and it's nice to see Dom and Brian back together and continue growing their friendship. But yeah, just not one of the worst, but not one of the best. Just bang straight in the middle. Coming in at 5th place is The Fast and the Furious. God, these actors didn't know what they were signing up for when they wrote on to be into this movie. It's a fun movie, especially looking back from where this franchise has gone. It's a nice, simple story with these characters where you really do buy into that family dynamic. You know, on paper, just it seems bad, but the under-average script mixing with these characters and the tone, it just works somehow. I can't really describe it. It just, maybe it is factoring in that I have come back to look at this, but it really does enhance your watch after seeing all what's come after it as well. So this is actually one of the strangest experiences I've had watching a movie, because everything seems quite bad. It's hard not to enjoy it. That's why it's really hard to review some of these movies. There's a lot of cheesy moments, there's a lot of cheesy characters, and the script is bad, but you'd have to be a real killjoy to hate this movie. Coming in at 4th place is Fast and Furious, Hobbs and Shaw. I need to start off by saying, when this was first announced, I wasn't too excited. Obviously, I said Hobbs and Shaw were great in Fast and Furious 8, but I thought they were milking it by throwing these two in the leads and making a whole movie out of it. But I was wrong, and it really does work. Not only does it provide those hilarious interactions, but also some backstory and some personal development for these two characters, as well as Vanessa Kirby fitting right in and keeping up with these two actors. There were two surprising cameos which I won't mention, but I was very shocked but happy to see them, and they did fantastic as well. On paper, I thought this was going to be one of the worst in the franchise, but it was a pleasant surprise and delivered one of the more entertaining ones in the whole franchise. A recurring theme of these later Fast and Furious movies is how they've strayed so far from its roots, and that continues here, pretty much abandoning all sort of street racing ideas, swapping it out for some super soldiers, which, God, Idris Elba's great, but just having a Terminator-like character just doesn't feel like it belongs in this franchise. But everything's changing. Another thing is that a virus plotline is so familiar in action movies these days that I've run out of fingers counting how many there are. On top of that, the runtime is a bit too long for the kind of plot they were going for. It could have done with maybe 15 minutes trimmed off the edge, but overall a very surprising movie which I really did enjoy. Coming in at 3rd place is Fast and Furious 6. After Fast 5's a big genre change, this film continues driving this franchise in the same direction with another very solid entry. This time, in London. Although by now this franchise is no longer primarily about street racing, it does do its best to contain as many car sequences as possible. An interesting dynamic is established when they bring back Letty with amnesia, so she's fighting against Dom. There were some very fantastic action scenes here, from the tank to the plane, but there was also a subplot about Brian going to prison to get information, which, for how big of a deal it was, felt extremely rushed and was over within 10 minutes. But as I said, another great Fast and Furious entry. This was the first one I ever saw in cinema, and it comes in at 3rd spot. Coming in at 2nd place is Furious 7. Although containing all its craziness from past movies, maybe even going crazier than them, Furious 7 has a real serious approach when it comes to family. I think this contains some of the most emotional scenes in this whole franchise, which also ties into the unfortunate and very sad passing of Paul Walker during this movie's filming. How they managed to finish this product without him in some scenes, they did a very good job, and in fact they ended his story in a very, very sweet way, which I found very satisfying yet emotional. I actually personally think from this movie they should have ended the franchise, because they had left it in a very, very good spot. Otherwise, continuing on, they need to create another reason to end it, which wouldn't draw as much emotion as this. The lack of logic is a common feature in all these movies. Here it's put to the test with cars with parachutes falling out of the sky, but it's just fun and you can embrace it without feeling ashamed. Whilst everything's going on, we are introduced to Jason Statham, who turned out to be one of the best characters in recent years to be introduced, and he had a nice dynamic with Dwayne Johnson, who unfortunately was sidelined for a lot of this movie, which felt a bit odd considering he's such a big star to have him just in a hospital bed for the majority of this movie. And as I mentioned earlier on in this ranking, it does make things a bit confusing when trying to tie in Tokyo Drift and Han's death. It really does confuse things a bit more, but it was cool to see some returning characters from Tokyo Drift. But overall, as I said, this would have been the perfect place to end this franchise. It was a very emotional movie, probably the most emotional out of all of them. Certainly a very unique one, and it was a good send-off to Paul Walker. But narrowly coming in at 1st place is Fast 5. The ending of Fast and Furious, the previous entry, allowed for a very good concept to be played out here, with Dom escaping from prison, and constantly being on the run added some tension to it, as it felt like there were actual stakes. You can really notice a big difference between this movie and Fast and Furious, not just from story-wise, but quality. This felt like a much bigger blockbuster with fantastic action scenes compared to the previous one where it had mediocre ones, and just the scale of those scenes. Dwayne Johnson's Hobbs proved to be a good casting decision, which led to a lot more money coming to this franchise from a spin-off, as well as just being a likable presence on the opposite side of our family. The location of Brazil just allowed for some fantastic scenes and great scenery for these stunts to be played out in, and this is where the franchise really began to pick up some speed to improve it each movie going forth, except as it's peaked, I guess, in my opinion here. Bringing back the old characters just shows you're not ashamed of what's come before, even though there's a big change in the genre. Just having them all as a big group allowed for really good chemistry between all of them. Like all these movies, it doesn't make sense with logic, but you have to enjoy it for what it is, and I think it is a very good action movie as well as a very good Fast and Furious movie, and for that, it is my number 1 pick. So that was my Fast and Furious ranking. Please let me know, as I said before, what yours is down below. If you want to see that F9 review, remember I left a clickable card up in the corner here. Make sure to check that out, as it's more in depth and more passionate. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Please like and subscribe, it would really mean a lot. And I hope to see you in my next video.